Hello, and thanks for joining us on the first episode of Season 5 of Driving into the Future, a post-media driving production that brings together automotive industry experts to discuss important issues facing the personal transportation segment. And as we transition to electrification, there are many issues indeed. My name is Andrew McCredie, a senior editor with Driving, and I'll be the moderator of this one-hour event. Today's topic is a big one, namely 2035. That's the year many countries, including Canada, have targeted for all gasoline-powered new vehicles to be banned for sale. But in a country as big as Canada and with a cold climate during winter months, is that a realistic target? Will dealerships really only be selling EVs when we ring in the new year on January 1st in 2035? Seems fantastical. We've assembled a quartet of knowledgeable guests who will shed light on the answer to that question. Tim Cain is a data-driven automotive analyst and has extensive and varied experience in automotive retail as a sales analyst and market specialist. He comes to us today from his home in Prince Edward Island. Jordan Choby is a group vice president of powertrains for Toyota North American Research and Development. He's beaming in from Orange County, California. JD Nye is a director and Canadian automotive practice lead at JD Power. He is based in Toronto. Also based in Toronto, and last but certainly not least is David Booth, the senior writer at Post-Media Driving, who for more than 30 decades has informed, entertained, and at times infuriated readers of the National Post and Driving.ca. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. If your video quality is poor, click here to refresh stream. If you're having any technical issues, click on Help on the bottom right corner of the webcast page. Your help request will be emailed back to the email address you provided. And finally, if you would like to ask a question, click on the Questions tab on the far right of the screen, enter your question in the window, and they will be sent directly to us. We've already received a lot of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And a special shout out to Toyota Canada, who sponsors the Driving into the Future series. Despite being more than a decade away, there is a real sense of urgency around Canada meeting the federal regulation, also referred to as a mandate, requiring that all new passenger vehicles and light trucks sold in Canada after 2035 be electric zero-emission vehicle. These rules will be phased in gradually, starting with a 20% requirement in just 2 years and 1 month's time. For some context, last year we were at about 7.7%. Okay, Tim. Let's dive right into some data to set up this discussion. Can you provide a snapshot of where Canada sits in terms of EV adoption relative to overall vehicle sales?
Right. Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. So essentially, there's one short answer to this, which is that pre-pandemic, Canada was a market of roughly 1.9 million vehicles, and that works out to 160,000 vehicles a month, roughly. And about 3,000 of those each month were EVs. And I'm talking specifically about BEVs, pure electric vehicles. So that's about 1.8% in 2019. We're now a market of probably 140,000 vehicles a month, a little bit less, smaller market now, but roughly 9,000 of those vehicles each month are EVs. So that's roughly 6.3% of pure EVs. Now, that market that we're looking at now is prone to fluctuation, in part because we're still in this phase of real early adoption. So from one quarter to the next, including from the end of 2022 into early 2023, the market can shift quite significantly in terms of EV market share. So early adoption speaks to the fact that in 2018, 2019, you're seeing massive year-over-year growth in terms of the number of EVs being sold. You proceed to this year, the first half of the year in Canada, and EV growth was more like 25%. PHEV share was actually growing a little bit faster. So one interesting thing about the bigger, longer answer that I'd state to speak to this issue is the fact that EV sales data is not the most easily accessible in Canada, at least in terms of what the OEMs are providing. So there's a couple of reasons why manufacturers might not want to share data. One could be, sometimes it could be embarrassment. Sometimes it could be the fact that they don't want to provide a competitive advantage. Tesla, who obviously which is a big component of the EV sphere, notoriously skips reporting on a monthly or market specific way. But more recently, Ford, historically Canada's biggest manufacturer, biggest seller of vehicles in the country, has vacated the reporting mechanism as well. So that means that we're not seeing sales data, not just for the Mach-E, but also for the F-150 Lightning. And that's important because we, for so long, wanted to see what EV share would look like when it started to be part of major sectors like small SUVs and pickups. And we can't see that right now. So what we're looking at is actually, for the most part, really quality data coming from the government of all things, as opposed to the manufacturers, which is, I know, part of what we'll be talking about as we spend the next few minutes together.
Okay, JD, let's go to you. The second annual JD Power Canada Electric Vehicle Consideration Study was released this summer, a fantastic document. And the findings are not what EV advocates wanted to hear, at least some of them. Overall, EV consideration in Canada has declined from 47% in 2022 to just 34% this year. Diving deeper into those findings, JD, what are the top roadblocks cited by these reluctant EV adopters?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for allowing me to join the panel. I think first off, EV advocates is an interesting term. Anybody working in the Canadian automotive industry today is, at least to a certain extent, an EV advocate, or at least an advocate of electrification in some way, shape, or form, given the enormous investment that has been made in the overall electrification of mobility going forward. But in terms of where I think you're getting at, just in terms of the kind of surprising news year over year to see such a significant decline, particularly when our neighbors to the south in the US, their numbers are moving in the opposite direction. I mean, not by leaps and bounds, but they're ticking up kind of slowly year over year from an EV consideration standpoint. And I think, as Canadians, we always like to think of ourselves as greener and more virtuous than our neighbors to the south. But at least when it comes to EV adoption, that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. And fundamentally, that comes down to kind of three core pillars. The first of which, frankly, is just pure affordability. I think the last time, in our inaugural study year, the Bank of Canada rate while we were in field for the 2022 study was still at 1 or 1.5%. Obviously, by the time we got into field this year in April and May, it was a very different financial landscape. And so affordability, and I think we'll dig into some of those numbers more specifically in a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, EVs remain rather expensive vehicles in this market at the moment, even with the various incentives that are in place. Number two, obviously, is still the issue of range anxiety, and more acutely range anxiety when it's cold. And one of the core differences between this market and, say, California is it does tend to get a little cold here from time to time. And so when we look at the difference between range anxiety and weather performance, Canadians versus Americans, that's where we see just an enormous difference in terms of that specific reason. And then finally is the infrastructure issue, which frankly, this is a sort of a complex answer, but the range anxiety issue tends to also be closely linked to the affordability issue, right? If I own my own home in the GTA or the Greater Toronto area, and I have a garage, then my range anxiety is significantly reduced, and that I get to charge my vehicle at home with a decent charger every single night. So I start my day with a quote unquote full tank of gas. That's just not the case for a significant percentage of Canadians. And so affordability, range, infrastructure, they all tend to play together in a bit of a reluctant soup at the moment.
Okay, great. Jordan, your company Toyota sells vehicles around the world, and in recent months has set a goal of 1.5 million EV sales globally by 2026. What technology is going to let you catch up, if that's the right term, to Tesla, which right now is such a commanding leader in the EV space? And how do those technologies differ from country to country? You're the perfect guy to answer that. You oversee all the powertrain systems, from ICE to hydrogen to EVs to plug-ins. So how do you tailor that for different countries? Is it what they demand? Is it, as Jordan alluded to, or as JD alluded to, is it climate? How do you tackle that?
Yeah, really good question. And the question that kind of keeps me busy every day, right? Finding out those right powertrain solutions for the different markets. So, and again, I mainly focus on US and North America as we're talking about today. But maybe to start, like you mentioned, we do believe in Toyota that the future is electric, right? It's more about the discussion of how we get there. We've announced publicly, as you mentioned, our goal of 1.5 million EV sales globally in 2026, moving to 3.5 million in 2030. So really aggressive plans to move that EV front forward. And we've showed recently, right, our new technology related to for EVs for all new platforms. A significant amount of that volume in 2030 will be on all new BEV platforms. At the same time, we have lithium-ion based EV cells coming online in our EVs. So they will be produced in North America quite soon. And then at the same time, we're starting to share our plans for solid-state batteries. But along those lines, with the EV, we really do believe and study really deeply our own concept of how to reduce carbon. So we have a vision of how to reduce carbon creation immediately, even some ideas to go back historically and reduce that, as well as this long-term kind of EV vision. So we've talked a lot about, moving forward with a portfolio powertrain approach. Right now, we're already selling 25% of our market share, our total sales volume in North America is hybrid and plug-in hybrid. So that's a significant contribution to reduce carbon, again, today, every day. But again, accelerating that EV volume. So for us, it's about meeting, the needs of the customer, each of those regions. I'm sure we're going to talk about the urban, suburban, and rural situations that Canada has, how we can make the right solution for those customers. We don't want to force technology on them, but just give them those choices to kind of contribute together to the greater good.
Okay, so I'm going to throw in a reader question here for you, Jordan. Doug from BC, since we mentioned Tesla, Doug from BC is asking, is Toyota going to be adopting the Tesla NACS standard and make Toyota EVs compatible with easy use of Tesla chargers?
Yes, we are. I think we publicly announced that recently. So we will use the NACS charging as a common standard. Right now, we use a common CCS standard, right? It's a SAE standard, but we will move to NACS, and that will become the SAE standard, just option for us, as well as many other OEMs here. Okay,
great. Okay, David, I'm sure you're chomping at the bit here. Who is buying EVs, and what do the demographics say about the future growth of adoption?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed going through all of the data that I've been able to get a hold of is that there's quite a different split between rural and urban. But one of the things that surprised me quite a bit was I thought, as many do, that it was sort of a downtown elite that was buying the most EVs. And while that's probably true on an absolute basis, in terms of a penetration level, it's actually suburbanites that are by double of their inner city compatriots buying the most EVs. So for instance, in Montreal, 22.9% of all EVs all cars are ZEVs. But in St. Lambert, it's 42.6, almost double. And that's because EVs are the perfect suburban vehicle. I mean, basically, it's almost like a fleet decision. You're going to drive a significant amount of mileage every day, and it's going to be repeatable, which means the low cost of operating, cheap electricity that EVs use will actually save you a boatload of money. On the other hand, since you're doing a repeatable thing every day, you're not using DC fast chargers. So in other words, you're saving a bunch of money, and you're also not using DC fast chargers, and you have no range anxiety. Okay, so it is very, very much an urban buy, but especially with the suburbanites. Now, the only problem with that is that how does that translate into a larger theme? What people do in suburbs, again, drive, say, 50, 100 kilometers every day, and they do it 5 days a week, is a lot different than, say, in some small urban community where they may drive 5 kilometers every day, and then they drive 600 once a month, and it's in extremely cold conditions. So it's no wonder. So for instance, again, in using your area as an example, in some suburbs of Vancouver, like Port Moody, EV penetration is 40%, go up into the northern regions of British Columbia, and it's 1%. That's going to make reaching the 100% level of BEVs quite difficult. So the three cities, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, account for 56 actually % of all EVs sold in Canada. So when people talk about super penetration and everything, and you know, the revolution, they're talking about three locales and three locales only. That doesn't speak to a wide proliferation of BEVs going forward, at least in the near future.
Yeah, so no question, that's the huge problem, is the late adopters, if you will. The governments have brought in incentive programs. Tim, for you, the rebate and incentive programs that governments provide are a polarizing subject, particularly on a philosophical level. But you have a different take on how they have historically skewed prices, which seems odd. How can you explain that?
Right. So, I mean, anytime there's government intervention, we're going to see that the market is skewed. So if we wanted to look at the EV market on the whole and assume that you can apply the basic laws of free economics, they simply aren't going to hold facts. Supply and demand is just not the only factor that you can take into account if the government is intervening. So government intervention, particularly the kind that differs so widely by jurisdiction, is going to dramatically alter the way that people are buying vehicles. But then there's this other component that relates purely to pricing. And it makes complete sense when you think about it, that manufacturers are probably going to try and make as much money as they can on a given vehicle. So one interesting example was in the US when the Chevrolet Bolt first lost its accessibility to EV incentives, to the $7,500 rebate. Lo and behold, in really short order, the price of the Chevrolet Bolt drops by between $5,900 and $7,500. So in other words, GM was attempting to capitalize as much on that as they could for as long as they could, but then in order to match the price to the market, having sold enough EVs to disqualify themselves from the rebate, the price drops instantly. We've seen it in Canada too, where so many vehicles undercut the mandated rebate amounts of $45,000, $55,000, $65,000 by $5. So when the rebate moves, suddenly you see that the prices move as well. We are going to continue to see this time after time after time, so long as government intervention is such a big component of EV sales, that the pricing is going to align itself with those rebates and ebb and flow over time.
So leading into another question from a listener, Stephanie from Ontario asks an interesting question along these lines, and that is, will the Conservative Party, if elected, delete federal EV incentives? Have we heard where they stand on this? Maybe David, you could take a run at that one.
Well, rumors are they're looking at canceling the ZEV mandate. Basically, they're going to try to cancel everything that the Trudeau Liberals have done. Whether they come up with some sort of fuel economy or emissions related legislation and standards to replace it is another thing. I will say this, Paul Liviere is often accused of being Trump light up here in Canada. And the Conservatives here do take a large cue from our southern neighbors. And that while the Republicans in the States are making big noise about Anti-Inflation Reduction Act and anti-EVs, they're not going to be canceling it. There's just no way, because all of the states that are benefiting from the IRA's battery manufacturing subsidies are either staunch GOP states or swing states. And there's just no way that they can make all the noise they want. If they get elected January or take power January 1st, in a couple of years, they are not going to cancel all those subsidies. There's no way. And I suspect that that will transpose quite well up here in North. We're taking, the conservative base is taking so much of its cues from the Republicans in the States.
So, David, do you think there should be government mandates to build fewer SUVs and pickups and more compact vehicles? I mean, more kind of a tinkering with the mandates?
I'm not a big fan of pickups. Personally, I mean, you know, there's people that need them. There are people that need to tow them. But the fact of the matter is they're mostly cosmetic. That said, I'm not in favor of any mandate on the forcing people to buy something they don't want, and that includes our current ZEV mandate. I do, however, have no problem with, you know, higher taxations on cars like that. The point is, though, and the biggest problem facing EV adoption is that because we love big cars and luxurious cars here in North America, the affordability problem that JD mentioned is a really big issue. That's where car companies can make their profits. And the average car in Canada, EV in Canada, according to Canadian Black Book, is $73,000. However, the median after-tax income in Canada, that means 50% of households are below this figure, is only $60,000. That's not a situation that we can tolerate. It means that the upper levels of the echelons can make the switch to electrics, but it means the bottom half of households can't. And so there's a schism there that'll have to be corrected before we can get anywhere near 100% ZEVs.
Okay, JD, from your research at JD Power, how important are these rebate incentive programs in the minds of consumers? Is it key? Are your findings finding that it is key for EV purchases?
Yeah, well, look, it's no accident that adoption levels in this country are at their highest in the jurisdictions where the incentives are also at their highest. Right? They do make a difference in terms of driving choice. Now, there's a lot has been said since this last time I said anything, but I wanted to piggyback on just again on because it's related to the incentive landscape, some of the affordability numbers that David was talking about. On our side, through our Power Information Network, we see all of the transactional data for about a quarter to a third of all the vehicles sold in Canada. So we've got kind of actual transactional prices. And so just to kind of piggyback on David's point, at the moment, the average, say, non-premium brand EV in Canada, the price that a actual customer pays for that vehicle on average is between $54,000 and $55,000 right now. So that's kind of 2023 year to date. Now the challenge, again, in bridging the gap for a higher percentage of Canadians, is that price point is over. At the moment, we sell about 60% of cars in this country below that price point, and so the average EV cost is over 60% of the kind of the rest of the marketplace. And so, and Tim, I take your point about not manipulation of the system around incentives, but pricing strategy of always that take those into account. And so I do agree that there's some challenges with the incentive landscape, but frankly the gap that exists today between an average EV and an average ICE vehicle, particularly when you get into the types of vehicles that most Canadians want. I mean, for a long time, we would hear that the average price of the difference between an average ICE vehicle and an average EV was $5,000, and that was reported widely, and that's kind of what a lot of people believe to this day. And if you really squint at the numbers, you can make that $5,000 argument work. The challenge is that doesn't really take into account the nuance of actual buying habits. And so by far the most popular vehicle type or segment in Canada today is the small SUV. And if I want to buy a small SUV ICE vehicle or a small SUV EV, now that gap in pricing is closer to $20,000, depending on where I live in this country. And so, while you could probably government mandate or incentivize away a $5,000 gap, a $20,000 gap is going to require some other solutions, frankly, from legislators, manufacturers, the citizenry in general. It's going to take some work to close that gap.
Okay, well, let's switch from policy solutions to technology solutions. Jordan, we've talked about cold weather in Canada, obviously, as an issue for EV adoption. The technology that Toyota is working on, you oversee all the different powertrains. What are you seeing in the future that can kind of improve this cold weather running for EVs? Are you guys working on that? Is that a constant in your meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. None of our vehicles do we want to work to develop just to like an advertising label number, like a test pattern kind of number. We want to make sure that real world performance is really impressive and great for the customer as well. That's what brings them back to the car, right? So a lot of work's being done to improve, we'll call it system energy efficiency in the vehicle. That includes HVAC systems, et cetera. EVs are so efficient that any energy used to run, again, HVAC systems, audio, multimedia, et cetera, can dramatically be visible to the customer in driving range. And an ICE vehicle, ICE combustion is maybe 30% efficient, so it kind of gets washed out. But we're working on that system efficiency to make sure real-world driving range is improved. Along those lines, I think there's a lot of work being done on preconditioning batteries. So when you're plugged in home overnight, you can set up smart charging and driving schedules to precondition that battery, pre-warm it up so you can, keep that better range or have the full battery capacity, warm battery capacity when you take off in a day. And just a lot of general technology development in batteries as well. But definitely working on improving that whole experience for the customer.
Okay, Roger from Ontario has a great question up this alley for you, Jordan. He's asking, is it possible and even practical to put more battery capacity in a plug-in hybrid to extend the range?
Absolutely. So we're really love our plug-in hybrids. Maybe apologies. I think the RAV4 Prime is always in demand and unable to get from many of my friends and family, as well as I think around North America, maybe around the world. But the plug-in hybrids from our RAV4 Prime, the Prius Prime, there's a new RX plug-in out. Great vehicles. Those are around 40 miles EV range for the daily driving, but there's absolutely room to improve longer range. We've shared publicly on a global note that there's opportunity for what we call practical BEV, so longer range plug-in hybrids that can add more battery capacity, more EV driving power. So practically you can drive an EV in your daily commute each day, charge it home overnight, but you still really have that freedom for long trips, freedom for towing, be it, in a larger vehicle that a plug-in hybrid can bring. And still that's again, plug-in hybrids we think are great from the customer viewpoint, performance viewpoint, but still we can use significantly less battery material and minerals and material to create that. We share often 1/690, maybe one EV battery is worth 6 plug-in hybrid batteries worth as 90 hybrid batteries. And there's really good benefits when you add and distribute that battery capacity to different vehicles to reduce carbon quickly.
Okay. So JD, back to you. In this great JD Power study, it really drilled down on the consideration of EV purchases from a regional perspective. Western Canada was 46% of consumers in British Columbia indicated interest in owning EVs, 39% in Quebec, 34% in Ontario, and then it kind of drops off. Atlantic Canada's 26% and the prairies at 22%. We have talked about how the rebates influence things. Are there other things you're finding in your studies and research that can kind of explain this discrepancy between the big provinces and the smaller ones?
Well, yeah, I think the fact of the matter is Canada can rarely be looked at as a single unit, right? We're very much a nation of regions, and the EVC study this year clearly shows that. We mentioned the incentive landscape, so obviously consideration is at its highest in the jurisdictions where incentives are also at their highest. But frankly, and to speak to the other point that David was making about the gap between even between urban and suburban EV ownership, that reality goes back to the point I was making previously about suburban home ownership just it's making the EV transition easier, right? If I happen to rent an apartment in downtown Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, that my charging reality is much more kind of muddied than it would be if given my good fortune to have a home in the Toronto suburbs. My charging reality is a much simpler prospect. And then frankly, when we get into smaller jurisdictions or smaller populations, the current build out of charging infrastructure more or less maps to the population of the country. And so while in our study, in our report, we had a page that we called like the case of the Richmonds. And so if you look at I think it was where Richmond, BC, obviously, where if I don't have access to home charging and I live in Richmond, BC, my life is pretty good from an EV ownership perspective. There's lots of infrastructure around. And as we work our way down to the small town of Richmond, Quebec, in that case, if I don't have access to home EV charging, now I've got a potential real challenge on a kind of a day-to-day basis operating my EV in that particular town or that particular community. And so, while at risk of sounding like a broken record, frankly, the challenges across the country and the discrepancies that we see in EV adoption or likely adoption, really, they do still fall under the broad buckets of affordability, range, and infrastructure. They just happen to be much more acute outside of the major metro areas.
Okay, Tim, you live in Prince Edward Island, a slower to adopt province. I mean, what are you seeing? You live and breathe cars. I mean, what are your neighbors saying? Do they ask you about EVs a lot? Is it top of mind, or is it kind of something that isn't quite there yet?
Right. I mean, yeah, my neighbor has 3 pickup trucks, and he is a guy who lives in the house by himself. So that speaks to one aspect of it. On a more data point, I mean, we have a pickup truck too. I've driven EVs through the winter. It's not as though there's no experience here. The incentive structure in Prince Edward Island, as an example, is really, really strong. So you combine the federal and the provincial, and there's $10,750 off an EV, $5,000 off a pre-owned EV, which is a bit unusual. So what we have here is 3% EV market share roughly this year, which is significantly stronger than what you'd see in something like Saskatchewan, another somewhat rural market where the EV market share would be 1/3 of that, about 1%, but obviously a far cry from other really strong incentive markets like BC, where that EV market share is well above 10%. So we're going to say the same thing over and over. In one aspect of this is that what we're dealing with here is an affordability issue that is going to be more prevalent in a rural area. So if you could remove some of these other issues, let's say you could remove the issue of range, let's say you could remove the issue of the charging network, let's say you could remove the issue of availability, which is still an issue in some smaller places, you are still going to be left with this issue of affordability that's going to be the prime factor that's driving this conversation, particularly in a rural, I think I would say particularly in a rural market. So what you have then, because of the incentive structure, combined with and more urban markets, combined with potentially different income levels, is a market like BC, where you see roughly 12% of overall vehicle sales for the country, but 26% of the overall EV sales, to go back to some degree to what JD was saying, or even in Quebec, where it's roughly 1/4 of the market at large, but 39% of EVs. So you come to a place like Prince Edward Island, rural Nova Scotia, rural New Brunswick, Newfoundland, there is an availability crunch that's the dealers are going to face as well, but above all, affordability is still the driving factor.
Yeah, so David and I have talked about this on his Motormouth podcast a lot. What the EV revolution really is looking for is the Model A or the Volkswagen Beetle. This kind of segment busting vehicle that comes in at, let's say, $25,000, has a range of 400 kilometers, And then suddenly that opens up to, as David said, people with incomes, maybe in the 60,000 range. So David, you're a tech geek. Where is that going to happen? I mean, is that possible, or is that something that is just wishful thinking?
Well, battery prices were supposed to go continuously down. And the idea was they were going to be $100 a kilowatt hour already. And people are still predicting $70 a kilowatt hour in the near future. Unfortunately, that hasn't transposed. Everything's gotten short supply. There's been inflation. Battery prices per kilowatt hour are going up instead of going down. The problem there is that as we try to meet all these ambitious targets, they'll be requiring more and more batteries. And the laws of supply and demand say you can't increase the demand for something and also cut its price. And so we're going to run into problems where, because the average cost of manufacturing a battery is about 52% strictly the minerals, economies of scale aren't going to have as much effect on battery prices going forward. In fact, I'd tell you that another Tesla innovation called the GigaPress, which is making huge pieces of the car, in fact, the whole rear subframes and the entire front subframes out of one piece, is reducing the cost and the manufacturing cost of cars. Toyota's going to be copying it. Lots of other people are copying it, and it will reduce the cost of these cars. But will it be enough? The scariest thing I think about ZEV mandates is that I don't see electric vehicles getting a lot more affordable in the near future if they're built in North America or in Europe. I mean, Volkswagen's promising a 25,000 euro EV. Tesla's been promising a $35,000 car, and now a $25,000 car forever, and we've not seen it. And the problem is there's only one place you can buy a cheap EV, and that's China. Okay, they've got EVs over there that have adequate range, maybe not 400 kilometers, but maybe over 300, that cost the equivalent of $15,000 US. And the Americans have a huge 27.5% tariff. And I did some calculations, and that might not even be enough to prevent China from having a cost advantage, even paying that tariff, coming to North America. And the only it's so far prevented them going into the United States. And by association, Canada isn't a big enough market to come to North America without going into the United States. But that's the only reason why we haven't seen a huge influx of Chinese EVs into Canada already. And I mean, that's one of the problems with this absolute 100% ZEV mandate. To get to the 60%, I think you said, JD, of people who buy a car below, say, $50,000 or $55,000, we can't get there in short order, but the Chinese can get there anytime they want. And that means a ZEV mandate also might mean a sacrifice of our own native industry here in Canada, just like it's happening in Europe. And they're having it's a major kerfuffle right now in Europe because the Chinese are invading the all of the nations in the EU, and all the automakers over there are really, really petrified.
Okay, Jordan, talking about this kind of evolution of batteries, Toyota has certainly been a proponent and a long-time R&D company that is focused on solid-state batteries. Can you just tell our listeners maybe what the difference is between a solid-state and a lithium, and what maybe the advantages will be with that battery?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we recently shared about our progress we've made and our plans to commercialize solid-state batteries. So solid-state simply is changing liquid electrolyte in lithium-ion battery cells to a solid electrolyte, polymer-based solid electrolyte. The benefits really are, first and foremost, safety, right? We have to make sure that that's good for all cars in all situations, but solid-state helps us get there more easily. And then with that, we can improve charging times. We can reduce battery size, which helps us package more batteries, expanding cruising range and maybe even battery power, so performance. Biggest item that we've been working through for many years is battery durability. This new solid state material, again, polymer based, it's called sulfide solid electrolyte. You have to make sure that through the various life cycles of charge and discharge that there's no breakdown in that material. And we've made great progress with that material with a partner we've announced, Imetsu in Japan. So we have plans to move from small scale pilot production now to it's a large pilot plant or a small commercialization plant and put vehicles on the road and globally in 2027, and then ramp that up with a larger commercial space and launch in 2030. So excited for that. It's not a step function. We'll change all lithium from liquid electrolyte to solid state, but it will be another wave of battery technology coming. And I really believe in the EV space or even PHEV space that the progress for EV battery technologies is not done. It's just ramping up right now. And I think this is one of the examples.
Jordan?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of bright minds working on it.
Jordan, can I ask one question? We've been talking about cold weather. How do solid states perform in cold weather? I've read about some specific technologies that are around -30. They're not happy. In your research, in your working, what are we seeing about that? Because as we've been discussing, it's pretty important here.
Yeah, I think maybe all batteries don't love cold, right? So, but my understanding is that solid state's comparable. So maybe not a dramatic difference versus the current lithium ions, but comparable and definitely being designed to work in the environments in Canada, et cetera.
What about, Jordan, what about the cost? Would a solid state battery comparable to a lithium ion be cheaper to produce?
Well, maybe David touched on quite a few really important topics of the macroeconomics of, we'll say, battery cost, battery production. I think it has good potential, but maybe it's still not a night and day automatically create you a $20,000 EV vehicle. So I think good potential to reduce, but still work to come. And manufacturing capacity, et cetera, everything kind of to come to support that.
Right. Okay. So JD, back to these wonderful numbers your study has produced. This one is really cool, I think. So you guys found that 55% of vehicle shoppers have never even been in an electric vehicle. It's a big number, to be sure, and it is enlightening that among consumers in Canada who have rented, borrowed, or test-driven an EV, your study found that 43% say they are somewhat likely or very likely to consider an EV. So it sounds like it's an education thing. I mean, how do you see kind of solving this thing of trying to get that 55% of people into an EV?
Yeah, so I guess first off, the 55% number that is getting better year over year. A year ago, that number was 60%, and so manufacturers are making some progress in getting more people in the vehicle. But to your point, the kind of the adoption curve or the consideration curve does move upwards sharply with each kind of incremental new experience a consumer has with these vehicles, and that's not surprising, right? For the most part. EVs are super cool. They're a lot of fun to drive. The acceleration profile is awesome. And so as people get to experience that for themselves, and then also, get a kind of a realistic everyday view of, what does 400 kilometers of range look like for the average person, they do tend to find that, that range, to David's point around kind of repeatable suburban commuting experience, does tend to fit the lifestyle and needs of a lot of people. So as someone's personal experience with these vehicles kind of moves up that experiential rank chart, so to speak, from nothing to my friend has one and I rode in it, to I got to drive it, to I rented one, and ultimately to I've owned one of these vehicles in the past or currently own one of these vehicles. The level of kind of next vehicle consideration goes up dramatically. And so it's one of the talking points we've been sharing with our clients in the study, namely the manufacturers, that, and anything from an OE perspective, or certainly from a kind of grassroots dealer perspective, anything you can do to get more Canadians into these vehicles, it is something that is going to certainly help spike overall consideration.
Right. And one of the, part of the collateral damage, if you will, of the lack of inventory, in other words, every EV a dealer would get would just be out the door because it was on a wait list. That kind of limited people's possibility to go in and test drive an EV, go down to their local dealership and there's like two EVs there that are test drive models. So that's beginning to change. I know auto shows have really pivoted and all have indoor tracks now, where a lot of the manufacturers will have their EVs. And I've seen lineups of 5 hours at the New York Auto Show for people just to drive a track inside for about 3 laps in an EV because they're so excited. So it seems to be what we're happening. But Tim, it sounds like this inventory problem, I mean, maybe a silver lining of the stockpile, particularly in the States that are showing up at dealers, might help that people will get it. But why are we seeing this stockpile now in the States?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we are in something of or at least approaching the end of an early adoption phase, right? So we're going to see not only the fact that the people who really wanted one probably have one, but there's this other component, which is that supply is just beginning to ramp up even as demand remains high. So it's been pretty widely reported that that EV inventory in the States is starting to pile up. Essentially, OEMs like to look at days supply. So let's say a dealer is routinely selling 50 cars a month. They've got 100 cars in the lot. They're looking at a 60-day supply. And that's sort of where OEMs historically were happy to be, or most OEMs were happy to be. 30 days, you're looking at supply getting quite scarce. Obviously, we've seen over the last couple of years a lot of 0 and 5 and 10 day supply. And then at 90 days, OEMs are generally beginning to get a little uncomfortable that their supply is perhaps too much. So what was so often reported over the course of the fall was that U.S. inventory of conventionally powered ICE vehicles in the fall was sitting around 57 days. Pretty decent. That's kind of where OEMs would historically like to be. But EVs were sitting at more than 90 days, or well in excess of 90 days, which is far more than most OEMs would be comfortable with. The thing is, I guess there's two caveats to that I'd share. One is we're looking at a fairly short time slot, right? And so often these conversations, whether we're talking about EV market share or EV interest, we're so often talking about a brief time slot in a nascent category. But the second thing that I think we have to keep in mind, and I'm sure we're all mostly aware of, is the way in which we talk about EVs is kind of humorous. We wouldn't generally decide to have a conversation about, if we were just dealing with conventionally powered vehicles, and lump Toyota Tundras, Corollas, and Siennas all into one bucket and analyze their inventory or anything related to those vehicles. EVs cover a really wide spectrum, and we kind of do tend to talk about them in one bucket. This is EVs. This is the nature of where they're sitting. What we've seen in the US, the inventory situation over the last year essentially divides things into two. So yeah, you do have that premium level, and they're going to see inventory sitting higher than others in a lot of cases. But this other component was essentially, to harp on this subject again, the nature of how mandates evolve and incentive structures evolve. So on August 15th last year, Hyundai was having no problem in the United States selling Ioniq 5s. One day later, literally overnight, their incentive program disappeared with the IRA. They lost a $7,500 rebate on that car. Ioniq 5 sales went from 2,800, 2,900 in June to 1,300 in September after the incentive program went away. So that's kind of a long way of saying that when we're talking about EVs in the States, it's not just the fact, or in any market, it's not just this component of EVs operate in different segments, but there's these two categories of EVs, which are the rebate eligible and the rebate ineligible, and the way in which their inventory builds up is going to be really different.
Yeah, I mean, EVs are called disruptors, and it's not just from a technological aspect. It seems all facets of the automotive industry and the dealer network and inventory are kind of put on its head. We all have to kind of relearn things or learn new things, which I think is part of the fun of it.
Okay, Andrew, I can add a little bit of Canadian context.
Sure, go ahead.
Too, if you like. And we again, through all the transactional data we see, we're looking at the same kind of information, but from a specifically Canadian lens. And to Tim's point, I think the stockpile might be a strong word there, but depending on which side of the kind of premium, non-premium side of the fence you sit, I think you're having a very different experience right now. On the non-premium side of the house, days to turn is the number that we track. I mean, it's up a little bit, but gross profit is more or less flat year over year. Again, that's on the kind of the non-premium side of the house. Not surprisingly, those would be more likely to be incentive eligible vehicles. On the luxury side or the premium side of the house, that's where we do see gross profits down quite a bit year over year, and days to turn almost doubled in the luxury set. So those incentive ineligible vehicles are certainly a little bit tougher to sell this year than they have been in the past.
Okay, David, I know you love the crystal ball stuff. So let's move ahead. As I mentioned, January 1st, 2035, we wake up that morning, but a few provinces haven't achieved 100% EV adoption. What's going to happen? I mean, is it just going to be, okay, let's just kick this down the road and make it 2040? I guess it will depend on what government's in power at the time, but what do you foresee as maybe some of the side issues if that's the case?
Well, a lot of hard decisions to be made. Let's understand that the ZEV is very much a political mandate. I mean, there's technology involved, but it's very much a political mandate. So just an equation. Quebec, Ontario, maybe BC gets somewhere close to 90%. Alberta and Saskatchewan don't get anywhere near. And a liberal government is in power, which is historically, and let's be honest about this, not been favorable to those areas. Are they going to actually enforce 60% of Albertans that have so far not decided to buy an EV to suddenly not have access to the vehicles that they're showing they want? Could they do it? I mean, as outrageous as it seems, it's possible. I mean, there's been historical precedent for that. In fact, we're fighting about it right now with the Clean Energy Act, and also with Daniel Smith in Alberta trying to invoke this Sovereignty Act. So there's that problem. The other thing is a vote counting question. Let's just say that we're at 92% by Canada. Actually, Alberta and everybody gets with the program. We're at 92%. 8% are not buying EVs yet. Well, it'd be easy for a party in power to say, well, we can just discount those 8% and force them to buy an EV after January 1st, or they cannot buy a car. We can discount them. We can still get elected if we ignore them. On the other hand, if Canada reaches 70% ZEV by 2035, that's 30% of eligible voters who've said they don't want an EV. And I can't imagine in any way, shape, or form any political party saying, oh yeah, we're going forward with a ZEV mandate and we're going to ban ICEs. I mean, it'd be political suicide.
Yeah, and talking about the Sovereignty Act, it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that if we do reach 2035 and Alberta is at 60%, they just say we're still going to allow our dealerships to sell gas cars. That raises a fascinating thing where what about a person in Banff, or not in Banff, in Revelstoke, BC, drives 50 kilometers to the east and buys a gas pickup truck and drives it back. So that whole issue is massive also.
Yeah, well, that's the arbitrage question. The Americans don't look to be going anywhere near a ZEV mandate. So that means even if we do have a ZEV mandate, I mean, all that'll mean is along the border, a whole bunch of super dealerships selling diesel pickups will come up. The dealers will simply put 50 or 100 kilometers on them, or whatever it takes to just to qualify as a used vehicle. And Bob's your uncle, they'll be coming across the border. It's a lot more complicated than somebody just saying you must. It really is. And the only bad thing about the BEV market right now is overall, not just on technology, but mandates. The government and proponents are just saying, look, if we just switch our current cars to 100% battery electric, all our problems go away. And that's just not true.
Yeah. So Thomas, I don't know where Thomas is from, but he's submitted a very provocative question. I'll just throw it out to the four of you. Anybody just raise their hand and away you go. So Thomas asks, how many more years will gas be available for internal combustion engines?
The actual fuel?
Yeah. I mean, how you know, we're already seeing, I mean, in urban, not in urban centers, but in city centers. I mean, in Vancouver now, I think in the downtown core, there's one gas station left. In my neighborhood, I'm seeing gas stations get bulldozed and condos go up.
Well, I mean, that's again, we know you guys are in BC are very pro EV. Try that in Sept-Îles, Quebec, or Cold Lake, Alberta, my friend, and you're not going to be a popular guy. So, I mean, we're also working on synthetic gas as well, which would make current piston engines at least relatively zero emission vehicles. Americans haven't been able to ban guns. Canadians haven't been able to ban cigarettes. It'd be a brave government indeed that come 2035 or 2040, when there's still 20 million or 22 million internal combustion powered cars on the road still, that says we're going to ban gasoline. I hope I live long enough to see a politician that brave.
Yeah, I can share a little bit.
Sorry, Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I can share a little bit, right? David mentioned some of the arbitrage discussion, U.S. regulations. So as reference in U.S., you know, there's quite a few different regulations enacted. So there's ZEV mandates by states. There's up to 17, I think maybe it's 9 or so have adopted that California ZEV mandate, working towards 100% in 2035. But important to note, even those states are supporting up to 20% of that volume be strong PHEV. So kind of over 50-mile EV range PHEV is counted as ZEV. I think with the ZEV state, actually nationally in the US, nationally, there is a regulation under the federal greenhouse gas rule that's basically driving to be 2/3 EV by 2032. So there's a big federal push as well in that space. But at the same time, there absolutely are tailpipe emissions criteria that's kind of ongoing. So there's still development ongoing in new engines to meet future tailpipe cleanliness emissions criteria. Some of those ones for the federal Tier 4 roll out in 27 to 29 model year. So we'll still be launching updated engines through that 2030 timeframe. So I think there's still a life. There's the whole heavy duty segment, heavy duty pickup, heavy duty commercial space that has life. So we think engine has a long life, even while we are accelerating a lot of electrification for sure.
Well, Jordan, like it always seems to me like from a manufacturing standpoint, the legislative landscape must be like just a nightmare to plan for. I mean, it always kind of strikes me as delightfully provincial that Canadians, like, we think we can elect a different set of officials and that'll change the global supply chain of vehicles. You know, for the 35 million Canadians. I mean, and how? Sorry, I'm asking you. I'm a former journalist, so I can't help myself. I mean, but just dealing with different jurisdictions and trying to plan for on a global scale. You know, the supply chain for automotive is the side of the global. Just must be an enormous challenge.
Yeah, I think we're always looking for common standards because it's just driving undue complexity, which equals cost, right? So from that point, we want to kind of simplify and standardize. But as far as changing items, we really have our own plan, our own vision, one, but then two, maybe planning for a more aggressive situation that we can meet. So we don't have so much ups and downs sometimes with changing directions and initiatives and state by state. In the end, we almost have to make a federal plan for US, for example, or maybe a Canadian federal plan. Even if the regions are different, we have to. So that's how we smooth it out, but it only means we must do the most aggressive plan in place.
Okay, gentlemen, the hour has gone quickly. It was a wonderful discussion. We're out of time now, so we're going to sign off. Just like to say, be sure to tune into the next Driving into the Future panel on Wednesday, December 13th, hosted by David Booth, where the topic is the resurrection of hydrogen. And on Wednesday, January 17th, again hosted by David Booth, the subject is how secure is the data in our cars. For your dose of all things automotive, be sure to check out Driving.ca, where you'll find the best in breaking news, videos, and reviews. You'll also be able to link to a recording of this session at Driving.ca, and there is also a podcast version of up on your favorite podcast platforms. Thanks again for joining us this morning, and thanks again to Toyota for their sponsorship support. Until the next time.